A lot of writers obsess over the rules of their magic system and completely ignore the only thing that actually matters: what the reader feels when the spell goes off. You can spend months engineering costs, limits, and clever loopholes, and still hand someone a chapter that lands with a shrug. The frustrating part is that two systems built from nearly identical rules can produce wildly different reactions in the reader's chests. One electrifies them, the other bores them senseless. Something is happening between the page and the reader that most craft advice never names. So I want to give you a model I use when I'm reading manuscripts or troubleshooting my own. I call it the reader reaction map, and the core claim is small but load-bearing. A magic system isn't really a set of rules. It's a delivery mechanism for one of four specific feelings in the reader's chest. Every design decision you make, every cost, limit, every rule you reveal or withhold, is a vote for one of those four feelings, whether you meant to vote or not. Now, I'm not going to tell you yet which one you should be aiming for, because that's actually the question this whole video answers, and most writers have literally never asked it of themselves. But I'll be upfront as well. This is my working model, sharpened over years of asking writers and myself a very simple question. What do you want your reader to feel when this spell goes off? And most of them, including myself, usually go quiet. The silence here is the diagnosis. If you cannot name the feeling, you cannot engineer the system. And no amount of rule tightening will fix what's actually a targeting problem. Picture two readers, both halfway through a fantasy novel. One of them can recite the magic's rules back to you cold. The costs, the limits, the loopholes. The other couldn't tell you anything specific about how the magic works, only that when it shows up, the air in the room changes. Now, the standard writing craft conversation calls the first system hard and the second one soft, and most writers stop the analysis there and pick a team. The real question hard and soft are actually measuring, though, is how much the reader understands, not how clear the rules are in your world-building Bible. You can have a magic system that's airtight in your notes and totally opaque on the page, and the reader experience will be soft no matter what your spreadsheet says. Hardness lives in the reader's head. So instead of two camps, picture a spectrum running from one end, where the reader can audit every spell, to the other end, where the reader knows almost nothing and isn't supposed to. Brandon Sanderson's Allomancy from Mistborn sits at the comprehension maxed end. Eventually you know which metal does what, and when Vin burns pewter on a rooftop, you can do the math with her in real time. At the other end, the Force in the original Star Wars trilogy, before anyone had ever uttered the word midichlorian, gives you basically nothing. You know it's there, you know Jedi can do strange things with it, and that's the entire briefing. Same axis, opposite poles, and most writing advice stops there. But comprehension alone doesn't explain why Gandalf falling in Moria feels totally different from Obi-Wan waving his hand at a stormtrooper, even though by this spectrum, both of them are soft. Something else is doing work. Something about whether the reader is leaning forward, trying to solve the puzzle alongside the protagonist, or sitting back and watching the magic happen to them. That posture, active or passive, is a second axis entirely. Cross those two axes and you get a 2x2 chart with four very different reading experiences sitting in the four corners. The horizontal axis is reader comprehension, low on the left, high on the right. The vertical axis is reader posture, passive witness on the bottom, active solver on the top. Let's drop into the top right corner first, inside a Mistborn fight scene. Vin is on a rooftop, she's burning pewter for strength and steel for the push, and she's keeping a running mental tab of how much metal she has left, because when she runs out, she's a normal-sized girl against trained killers. You, the reader, are doing this tab with her. You know the rules, you know the costs, and you're 3 seconds ahead of her predicting which metal she'll burn when the next enemy lands on the roof. That's a problem-solving quadrant, and the pleasure is co-investigation. From here, let's compress over to top left for the next one. High comprehension, but you're not solving, you're watching mastery. Spider-Man fires a web shot mid-swing and you grin because you already know exactly how the web shooters work. The pleasure is recognition, not deduction. This is a quadrant of tool mastery. But as we've defined before, comprehension is not everything. What happens when the reader barely understands the magic, but is asked to feel the weight of it? Well, drop down to the bottom left and you land in Moria, on the bridge. Gandalf turning to face the Balrog while the rest of the Fellowship runs. You don't know what Gandalf can actually do. You don't know what the Balrog is. You only know that whatever just happened was enormous, and that he's gone for the rest of the book. That's wonder. And notice the cost here. Soft magic earns its keep by creating the problem, not solving it. If Gandalf had stayed and explained the metaphysics of his confrontation, this scene would evaporate. Which brings us to the fourth quadrant, the one I'm least sure about and most curious to hear you argue about in the comments. Low comprehension, but the reader is somehow active, leaning forward, trying to make sense of something the text refuses to fully unveil. I call this one mystique. The cleanest example is The Force, before George Lucas decided to put a number on it. The reader was being asked to engage with something they couldn't fully grasp, and the engagement itself produced a kind of dread. It's the rarest of the four and the hardest to engineer, and if you've read modern fantasy that lives here, please drop the title below because I want to check it out. Now, this entire chart only matters if each cell actually predicts a specific reading pleasure. Each quadrant is basically a job description for your magic. In problem solving, you've signed a contract with your reader that says, every rule I teach you is a clue you can use to predict the climax. When Sanderson lays out his first law, that an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic, what he's actually saying is, you've taken the reader on as a co-investigator, and you cannot, in the final chapter, pull a brand new rule out and have it save the day. If you do, the pleasure of the puzzle collapses into the feeling of being cheated, and the reader doesn't always know how to articulate that, but they put the book down and they tell their friend the ending was off. Tool mastery then is competence porn, and I mean that affectionately. The reader isn't deducing anything here. They are watching a skilled operator use a known instrument well. Which brings us to wonder, the stakes amplifier, and it comes with a warning label here. Because you don't know what Gandalf can do, you don't know what's been lost when he falls, and that uncertainty inflates the emotional cost of the scene. So the warning is this: writers who want wonder and want their magic to also solve the plot's logistical problems will get neither. Wonder requires the magic to remain partly inarticulate, and a partly unarticulate system cannot also be a reliable narrative engine. You have to pick one here to make either of these goals work. Which leaves us with mystique, which could be framed as the harder cousin of wonder. Here it's about awe, not wariness. The reader senses the magic is sovereign and indifferent, and the protagonist is small in front of it, and this smallness is the point. The biggest pitfall here is specific and well documented. The moment you explain the source, mystique becomes trivia. George Lucas's own collaborators, the authors writing in the Star Wars Expanded Universe after the prequels landed, said the introduction of midichlorians robbed the Force of mystery. And Steve Perry, who actually used midichlorians in a 27 tied-in novel, called the concept less than inspired. Now Lucas insisted he never wanted the Force to be magic, that he wanted it to be a logical thing. But audience reaction overruled him in real time. That's a lesson I keep coming back to. The creator's intent doesn't determine the reader's experience. The reader's side is sovereign, and if you build for one feeling and deliver another, the reader's chest is the only courtroom that matters for the final verdict. But knowing the four feelings still doesn't tell you how to aim for one of them on purpose. So the next move is to introduce the design dials that actually do the steering. I have 3 questions for this, asked scene by scene, and they decide which quadrant you land in. How much does the reader know that the protagonist knows? How much does the reader know that the protagonist doesn't? And how much does the magic cost in a currency the reader can actually track on the page? Each of these answers slides the system across the map. A protagonist and reader who share full knowledge of the magic's costs and limits, with a price tag the reader sees ticking down in real time, that lands squarely in problem solving. Flip one dial, like hide the costs, and the same magic slides toward wonder, even if the underlying rules in your notebook didn't change at all. Same system, entirely different reader expectation, because of what you put on the page and what stayed of it. These are sliders the writer tunes per scene, not switches locked down at the world building stage. A novel can sit in wonder for 10 chapters and slide into problem solving for the climax if you've laid the comprehension groundwork in the middle stretch. That's actually how a lot of the strongest fantasy stories work. The magic feels mysterious early when you're being seduced into the world, and the rules get progressively legible as you near the climax so the resolution can satisfy. And locking down that reader promise underneath all of this, the emotional contract that decides which quadrant your magic should even be serving, is exactly the kind of clarity work my free fantasy story compass is built for. Links in the description below if you want it. Which brings us to the layer most writers default to and most craft videos spend 90% of their time on, the mechanical guts. Source, cost, consequence, where the magic comes from, what using it costs the user, what it leaves behind in the world. This is the layer where you get the cool detail about your wizards eating beetles or your sorcerers paying in memories. And I want to validate the instinct to start here, because it's not wrong, it's just misordered. These are useful questions and you absolutely need to answer them eventually. Source gives your magic flavor. Consequence gives your world its texture and its politics, like who's rich, who's persecuted, which kingdoms exist because of which metaphysical accident. But the mechanical question that punches above its weight is cost, by a wide margin, because cost is the only mechanical lever your reader actually feels in real time, scene by scene. Sanderson's first law lives or dies on cost being legible. A magic with vivid source and dramatic consequence, but a cost the reader cannot track, will still feel weightless, because weight is felt at the moment of use. So here's the ordering principle the whole pyramid is built on, the one I held back from the beginning. Design from the feeling down, not from the mechanics up. Pick the quadrant first, tune the dial second, and write the source cause consequence last. Most writers do this in exactly the reverse order. They spend 3 months on a magic system bible, draft for 6 months, and then sit there wondering why the magic feels like a stat sheet glued to a story. The stat sheet was never the problem, the targeting was. Tolkien understood the feeling first idea. He wrote a whole essay about it on fairy stories, where he called fairy an enchantment that cannot be caught in a net of words, for it is one of its qualities to be indescribable, though not imperceptible. He even warned that it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gate should be shut and the keys be lost. The interrogation of the magic itself destroys the experience. But with that said, I know that nobody actually writes this way on the first pass, and I'd be lying if I said I did. Most writers, myself included, start with a cool image likely. A girl who eats metal, a wizard staff thumping in a dark mine. You backsolve the system from the image, you don't deduce the image from a quadrant chart. So the reader reaction map is not a generator. The real job of this map is diagnostic. When your magic feels flat in chapter 12 and you cannot figure out why, you don't need more rules. You need to figure out which quadrant you were aiming for and which one you've actually landed in. Maybe you wanted wonder and the cost got too explicit somewhere around chapter 7, and the whole thing slid into problem solving without you noticing. Or maybe you were going for problem solving and you've been so generous with mystique flavored prose that the reader doesn't actually have the toolkit to predict the climax with you, and they're going to feel cheated when the answer lands. The reader reaction map tells you what broke, not what to build. So the question I'd leave you sitting with, the one the framework itself genuinely cannot answer for you, is which feeling your particular story is actually asking for. Not which one sounds coolest in a pitch. Not which one your favorite author uses. It's about what feeling the story in your chest is actually begging to deliver, if you'd stop arguing with it long enough to listen. And once you've locked the feeling your magic is built to deliver, the pressure shifts immediately to the world around it, because a magic of wonder collapses inside a world that feels like a video game level, and a magic of mystique dies in a setting with no soul of its own. So if you want to understand world building the way we just dissected magic, feeling first, architecture second, the next video pulls 7 mythologies most writers have never mined and shows you what each of them actually teaches you.